Are you ready?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, hello and welcome to the Academy Management Review Origin Series. My name is Rich McAdock. I am an associate editor at AMR and also a professor of management at Purdue University's Granite School of Management. Today, my guest on this episode is Robert Gregory. He is a co-author along with Ola Henfridsson, Evgeny Kaganer, and Harris Kyriakou of a forthcoming research article in AMR that is called "The Role of Artificial Intelligence and Data Network Effects for Creating User Value." So welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Well, good to be with you today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So could you briefly just give us a short elevator pitch summary of what the paper is about?
Sure, happy to do so. Yeah, so what we argue is that the recent advancements in artificial intelligence and the growing availability of data give rise to a new category of network effects. And we call that in the paper data network effects. And what we say is that a platform exhibits data network effects if the more that the platform learns from the data it collects on users, the more valuable the platform becomes to each user. And so to understand the nature of the network effects that are at play here, it is important to consider the role of artificial intelligence here. So the possibility for third-party benefits arises because of the ability of AI to transfer value stemming from data-enabled learning to all users simultaneously during consumption lifetime and without significant delay. So each user benefits from the learnings that are generated from the user base. And so in the manuscript, what we do is we theorize this relationship between AI capability of a platform and the value perceived in the platform by its users. And we also explain how that relationship is moderated by platform legitimation, data stewardship, and user-centric design. So, maybe later we can go a little bit more into detail on that.
Sure. So let me just clarify for the audience that this is a different kind of network effect than people have usually thought of in the network effects literature, in the sense that your typical network effects are about the larger the installed base of the platform, the more others in the platform I can interact with, right? And it's just based upon having more people for each user to interact with. But here, it's not based on me interacting with those other users directly. It's about what the platform has learned from those other users and how it can apply that learning to the platform's interaction with me. So it's not necessarily about me having lots of other people out there to interact with. It's about the platform having been trained by all those other people to do a better job in its interactions with me. Am I understanding it right?
Yeah, I think this is very important that you highlight this. The traditional network effects concept and literature really views value for each user as a function of the network size, or the number of users in the installed base. And so there's this assumption that just having a large number of users will then directly lead to that additional value for each user. And this has certainly been true for a long time period in our history of network effects and the examples that we have. Like if you think about the fax machine, the telephone, if you think about the early way in which a platform like Facebook operated, definitely those network effects were clearly in the foreground. But nowadays, in the context of artificial intelligence, What the platform really primarily interacts with is the data. It's the data collected on each user, and initially the machine learning algorithms on these platforms are trained with training data, and then later when the AI gets launched and it is exposed to the user base, the users interact with the AI, and then obviously the network size kind of also plays an enabling role, because I mean, if you have a large network size, then the algorithms are also able to collect more data. But primarily what the AI on the platform is interested in, or what it interacts with, is the data. And so what we say is that value is then becoming a function primarily of the data, and especially the learning from that data. So in a way, it's the learning from the data collected on each user and scaling that learning through AI, as opposed to traditional organizational learning, which is not scalable, right? So, and that's where the value then, the main value then comes from. And that's why we think it is justified to talk about a new category of network effects, data network effects.
Right.
And so that's kind of the main kind of argument that we make.
So in a sense, the network effects are from the data from the other users, not really from the other users themselves, basically. So if I had one of these artificial intelligences that was built from data from a large network, I could, in theory, I could take that intelligence and put it into a completely new network. Even if it's a tiny network, I would still have that knowledge built in, right? Of course, it would be static. It would be based upon, you know, the knowledge that was built up to that point, right? And you would need a larger user base to continue learning from there. But it's in some sense a transferable form of network externality. Is that right?
Well, now this is extremely important what you just highlighted. I appreciate that. I mean, this is very important, and we need to understand what are the core characteristics of artificial intelligence that enable these data network effects, right? Because there's a lot of confusion out there. You know, is it just the network, or is it actually a new category of network effects? And we need to consider the characteristics of AI in order to understand exactly what you just explained. So basically, there are two key characteristics of AI that, from our perspective, stand out. One is that AI is learning from individual cases to identify and translate patterns into predictable models that feed into this iterative improvement of products and experience for other users, right? Not just the single user from which the data is collected and analyzed, but as you also just alluded to, as you were speaking to me, you know, this idea that it can actually be transferred. So the new insights, the new knowledge that is then codified in the form of these improved algorithms that are embedded into the next version of the product. So the products and the services, they constantly evolve based on this learning from the data. And so that's how this value becomes kind of, you know, becomes encoded, it becomes codified, it becomes transferable, and that happens in near real time as well, which makes it really like an externality. And then the second thing is that, you know, with AI is this ability to efficiently scale data-driven learning and instantly release the resulting improvements to the product, so that the product experience is available to each user, right? To affect the current value of the product for each user. And so those key characteristics of AI, we need to consider those to really understand the data network effects.
I understand. Okay, perfect. So let me ask you to go into a little bit more detail with regard to some of the propositions that you develop in the paper. So here's figure 1 from the paper, which summarizes the various propositions that you develop in the paper. Maybe could you talk us through the idea of these propositions?
Right. So if we look at the main proposition, basically what we argue is that when we think about the role of artificial intelligence on platforms, we think about what does the AI offer as a capability on the platform, right? It offers you two key capabilities, higher speed of prediction and higher accuracy of prediction. So, so for example, we think about how does that impact the network, right? The network of users, which then kind of leads to higher perceived user value, right? So the AI
Right.
is able to better predict, for example, whether there will be good behavior of users or not, and be able to predict those kind of things. So it has an impact on the behavior of the users to make that behavior more conducive to the goals of the platform and the different sides of the platform, right?
Sure.
So there's this role of AI in influencing the network of users, and then impacting the perceived user value. So that's the main kind of relationship. And because we thought a lot about what's the value that artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms in particular, what do they offer, right?
Right.
And then that's the main relationship. But then there is this moderation, because these learning algorithms, they are obviously fed with and they are trained with data, right? And so there's this idea that data quantity and data quality both matter to moderate this relationship. So in the presence of higher data quantities and better data quality, in the presence of that, this positive effect of the speed and accuracy of prediction on perceived user value that effect will be stronger, right?
Right.
And that highlights that platform companies need to do a good job at managing data, right? And so that's that relationship. And then when we think about user-centric design, well, we also know that the engagement of users on these platforms, the intensity at which these users actually engage with the platform and use the products, that also kind of influences the extent to which these predictions will have an impact or not
Right.
on the platform.
Naturally.
So and then basically the third one is really interesting, the platform legitimation, because here what we talk about is things like the AI black box, and the idea that a platform company needs to ensure the explainability, right, the interpretability of these machine learning algorithms and how they work. And they also need to ensure that they build in privacy by design and security by design principles into the design of the platform in order to ensure that personal data use occurs according to the general expectations of stakeholders of a platform, right? And so in a way, this moderator here is interesting in today's times, when we're talking more about stakeholder capitalism and the responsibility of these platforms. And so this is a very timely kind of debate that we're having right now, and that's that moderator kind of.
Exactly. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for talking us through that. That's very helpful. So turning to a somewhat different question then, beyond the paper itself, well, who should read this paper? Who's the target audience for this paper?
Right. So, I mean, first of all, we kind of wrote this paper with strategy scholars and platform owners in mind, because in a world where interactions on platforms are shaped more and more by the use of AI to learn from the data collected on each user, the data network effects, as opposed to traditional network effects where value is viewed to be mainly a function of network size, right? Then the data network effects are potentially a greater source of competitive advantage. And so we think that future research, well, we think that strategy scholars need to take into consideration this concept of data network effects in their study of competitive advantage, right? So that's kind of what we believe. And similarly, from a practical standpoint, platform owners, we know that some of the world's most valuable platform companies, in terms of their valuation on the stock markets, they actually compete on data network effects, right? And so we think that that's the kind of the main audience. But then we also kind of want to talk to information systems scholars and IT managers, because data and IT play increasingly strategic and integral roles for value creation and capture, right? And not just a support role as maybe in the past. And so the concept of data network effects helps understanding new value dynamics at play in contemporary platform settings, and the role of data-enabled learning in that context, where information systems scholars have been discussing that for a long time, but not in the context of strategy to the extent that we're doing it in this article. And then we also think that institutional scholars and regulators may be interested in our article, because the legitimacy of platform companies is increasingly at stake if they don't build these kind of design principles into the platform architecture that we talked about earlier, like privacy, security, if they don't ensure the explainability, the transparency, the accountability, and the fairness in their design and use of AI, right? So regulators may actually have to pay closer attention to these new logics of creating and capturing value from data collected on each user on the platform, and put guardrails in place. So we think that this is an interesting avenue for institutional scholarship, and then on the practical side, regulators as well. And then lastly, sorry for that long answer, but I think lastly,
okay. There's a lot of audiences for this paper, I can tell.
Yeah, there's a lot of audiences. So there's another audience that I think could be really interesting. Organizational scholars, and on the practical side, I think product managers, right? Because products and organizations are increasingly designed to reap the benefits from this growing availability of external data. And the concept of data network effects helps to understand the dynamics of iterative data-enabled learning and improvement that are at play when companies digitally transform their value propositions, and thereby also change the way that they develop products and the way that they deliver customer experiences, by attempting to differentiate themselves in the market. And so this happens increasingly based on these kind of dynamics that we kind of describe in the paper. So we do think that there is a need for organizational scholarship also to understand better, how organizational processes, how processes of product development, for example, how they are actually being transformed through the use of external data and these kind of dynamics, right? So that's another group of scholars. And of course, obviously, utilizing AI, and there have been, of course, other articles as well that have talked about this in organizational context. So I think, yeah, organizational scholarship is definitely interested in this as well.
That makes sense. That's good. So turning to a different question here, we do call this the AMR Origins series, right? So we are interested in the origins of the papers that we're talking about. Because I mean the idea of this series is to help demystify the process of theory development by asking the question, where does theory come from? So let me ask you, how did this project get started in the first place? Where did you get the idea for it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and love answering that, because I always tell that story. Basically, back in the days, so Harris and I, so two of the authors of this paper, the two of us started this project many years ago, and we were both working at IESE Business School, a business school in Barcelona in Spain back in those days. And that business school focuses mainly on MBA and executive teaching. And so we used the case method there, as known from Harvard. And I had written this case on Facebook in 2018. In the year 2018, I wrote this case on Facebook. And the data debacle at Facebook, right? And so I wrote this case, and I basically started using that case in my MBA and executive teaching, and so did Harris as well. And we had these discussions around teaching the Facebook case after classes, and we would kind of meet in the office, and we would have discussions around, and we would use the concept of network effect, so the traditional concept of network effect in our teaching of that case. And we realized again and again that this framework was just too limited to really provide a timely debate around the Facebook case. It was more about the data, right? And the AI usage. And so basically we felt that the traditional network effects literature was just not accounting for that kind of modern development of platforms. And so we had these debates, and we said there's something else at play besides network effects, right? And initially it's interesting, well, we'll talk about that maybe later, but the ideas have obviously evolved drastically since then. But we had this idea that network effects is limited, and there's this potential to perhaps make a contribution there. And so we started to theorize about that.
That's interesting that it came out of teaching, right? It came out of a dilemma that you experienced when you were teaching, rather than out of something from the literature per se, or even from observations of companies. It just was a limitation in how you could talk about a case study in a classroom. Yeah, that's That's a cool
Exactly.
story. Yeah. So, so what made this project interesting enough for you to want to devote your time to it? I mean, there's always a lot of projects that one could spend one's time on, and competing demands for time, and so one always has to make choices. Why choose this one over others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that every one of the authors of the paper have their own maybe motivation, but for me personally, I've been doing research on what I call my research digital transformation since many years, long before I even started writing this article. Originally, my research was about IT transformation, then it evolved to become digital transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big trends that we're seeing in that literature stream is the growing availability of external data and how that's kind of driving the transformation journeys in companies externally. And we see that it's originating from this platform settings. That's where it's originating from, this trend. And basically, so it's kind of an important phenomenon about which I've been talking for a long time. And so this kind of research topic fitted well into that research stream. And the significance of the topic was also underscored when we saw that The Economist had even published an entire special issue on the topic of data, and they even used the term network effects in their special issue there. And we were kind of surprised that the management literature had not really picked upon that systematically, right? So even though The Economist and others were talking about it, the management literature was kind of not talking about it, not to the extent that we would have wished for. And we saw that there were these underlying assumptions in the network effects literature that go back all the way to 70s, 1980s. And we said, well, what's happening today in the context of data is it just kind of departs from some of those fundamental assumptions that we have, that we're still making today in the literature. And so that kind of motivated us to really embark on this theory development project.
Nice. So I've noticed a kind of a trend. I don't know if it's a trend, but a pattern in the interviews I've done in this series. None of the research papers that I've interviewed people about in this series have been single authored papers. They've all been co-authored papers. And some of them with 3 or even 4 authors, like this paper has 4 authors. So maybe the days of the lone theorist are gone. I don't know, but clearly there's something about doing theory that may be different when you're doing it as a team exercise. So could you maybe speak to that? Tell us a little bit about what was the process of doing theory as a team like for you?
Absolutely. I mean, this was an interesting experience. So it started with me discussing this topic, with Harris, because Harris is somebody who has done research on artificial intelligence before, and he's also been using artificial intelligence in his research as a research method. And so basically, I always considered him to be kind of AI expert, and I was kind of more positioned at this intersection between information systems and strategy scholarship. And so I thought we fitted well together, and so we complemented each other in our discussions. And but then later down the road, we brought 2 other people on board. Evgeny Kaganer. Evgeny Kaganer brought a lot of expertise on board in understanding these various different platforms, their business models, and how they work, due to the extensive executive teaching, including platform strategy, having that as a core teaching topic for many years. So he brought a lot of practical insight to the table that was really useful. Plus, he had done some research using institutional theory, and so this institutional theory perspective, that's a whole different kind of theory, and where you need some expert deep knowledge there that he kind of brought to the table. And then Ola Henfridsson, well, we brought him on board due to his extensive experience in theory development in general, right? And so as a team, we kind of, we were able to pull this off, but it was really a team effort, and complemented each other extremely well throughout the whole process. Yeah.
So how did the project develop from that initial conversation that took place between you and Harris about the the case study and how to teach this case study better. From that point to the point where you had a manuscript ready to submit to AMR, how did the project develop?
Right. So initially, because of also the interest that Harris brought to the table, we initially kind of focused more narrowly on artificial intelligence and data, and we called it actually data learning effects, right? So we didn't even use the term network effects because we weren't even sure whether that actually, relates to this whole literature on network effects and externalities, and we weren't able to fully articulate it at that point in time yet. And so we kind of had quite a detailed story, and we even talked about machine intelligence versus human intelligence, and so there was like machine learning and human learning, and so we had a very different kind of a paper. We presented that at the Academy of Management annual meeting, and we got some feedback there actually, and there were some very senior editors in the room who kind of gave us very positive feedback. And so this idea of maybe submitting to AMR in the future, that kind of popped up already there in that summer, must be now like 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And basically from there, what we did was we presented an initial write-up of the paper to the AMR hackathon, which took place in Barcelona 2-3 years ago. And so basically we applied for the hackathon, we got accepted, we got invited, and we were assigned Alan Afua as an editor. Oh, great Alan. Editor. Yeah, Alan is such a generous and good editor, so we were very grateful, we were very happy. Yeah,
and he has deep knowledge on technology strategy. He's going to know
right that sort of thing. Right. I mean, he's written about the internet, and he's written about crowdsourcing, he's written about different topics that are at the intersection between strategy and the world of technology. And so basically he was very suitable to understand, he was very capable of understanding what we were trying to do, and was very helpful during the hackathon. And then through a series of further interactions with him that extended beyond the hackathon, he provided some additional advice beyond the hackathon, two-day time period. We kind of evolved this whole thing into a full-fledged manuscript to submit to AMR by the following summer. And so, and it eventually became a paper on data network effects. And that was mainly also due to the advice given by Alan Afua with his kind of vision of us being able to connect to the network effects literature, mm-hmm. and to have a very focused, contribution, very focused paper. So he was kind of very instrumental in helping us find that very targeted contribution target and that focus,
Very important in a paper to have, a laser focus on a single point is very valuable in a paper. So what were the biggest challenges that you faced in doing this project?
I think one of the big challenges that we faced was the skepticism and the pushback from reviewers after the first round in basically, here you're presenting a novel theory, arguing that there is a novel category of network effects. However, we've been doing this research for 30-40 years, and there's no such thing as a new category, and we don't believe you,
Okay.
And of course, when you are kind of going in and challenging, challenging established assumptions, obviously you will get pushback. Obviously, you need to be convincing about that. And so for us, it was a challenge in the beginning to be convincing enough that there was a need to problematize the existing assumptions in the literature, and to base new theory based on a new set of assumptions. And that was a challenge to convince reviewers. And as a result of that, it was also challenging to come up with an appropriate revision strategy. And so again, our editor Alan Afua provided us with very valuable guidance in the process. Well, I mean, he's a strong editor, and so sometimes that also helps, right? So that helps.
I hear you. Yeah. So I'm assuming that you won the reviewers over at some point.
Yeah.
So how did you do that? What new arguments or changes did you have to make to the manuscript to win them over?
Well, one of the things that we did was we backed off of some big claims, right? So initially we kind of framed the paper as, data network effects as a source of competitive advantage. And this kind of linkage between the concept of data network effects and this big concept of competitive advantage, we were not fully able to convince the reviewers of that linkage. We were not able.
That can be paper two.
That could be, yeah. We were not fully able to explain it, and that's also what Alan Afua said later. That could be paper two, and so basically, he provided us with that guidance after the critical reviewer feedback to back off of that big claim. So that's one of the things that we did. So we narrowed down the scope even further and made the whole article more tight, and we worked a lot on the causal logic of each and every proposition, so that every proposition, that the causal logic leading up to every proposition was rock solid. We wrote it again and again and again, and basically that helped. And also, of course, what helped was the overall writing style. So we came up with this narrative of how we could tell a story from proposition to proposition, as opposed to just disconnected, isolated pieces that are kind of, so make it really like a connected puzzle, and that it reads well as a story. And so we, and I think we were inspired a lot by Jay Barney's kind of talk during the hackathon, where he said, imagine writing an AMR article by, you step into a room, there's a party going on, you start off the chat with a story, and then somebody else builds upon your story. And so it needs to be, for having a good party and a good conversation, there needs to be, people building on each other's kind of conversations, and not kind of, changing the conversation radically in a different way wherever we go, because what are we now talking about? So,
right.
So having a good conversation at a party. So he kind of made that analogy to explain how do you write a good AMR article. And so we kind of tried to just improve the writing to really get it done. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm glad that's succeeded. That's great. So my last question is really a multiple question. Because I want to ask you about what impact you think this theory will have, or this paper will have, what impact you hope the paper will have. But I'm going to think about multiple different possible impacts, right? So I could think about the potential impact on future theory, the potential impact on future empirical research, the potential impact on future practice, the potential impact on future pedagogy, which is interesting considering that that's where this started, was in a discussion about how things were going in the classroom, and a potential impact on future policy. So I don't know if you want to address all five of those, of theory, empirics, practice, pedagogy, and policy, but take whatever combination you want and tell us a little bit about what impact you hope that the paper will have in any of those areas.
Sure, yeah. We can start with the theory. So we really hope that the paper will have an impact on network effects theory. I mean, this is a theory that has seen many contributions over multiple decades, and it is an enduring concept, and it is going to live further. But we hope that our article will help to broaden the scope of this concept. The scope of this concept, and so that it can evolve through our work. And so we do think that it may be interesting to examine interactions and the interplay between different types of network effects as well, right? So as alluded to a little bit earlier as well, of course, network size and the learning from the data, I mean, these different sources of value, they interact, right? And so it would be very interesting to analyze empirically how these interactions actually play out, and what types of interactions we see there in reality. Well, I mean, that's kind of already talking about empirical work, right? So
Sure.
I was kind of already talking about empirical work. I guess in terms of pedagogy, we do kind of think that that our work provides a more comprehensive, a more timely kind of framework to apply in teaching strategy at the intersection of intersection to the digital world. So anything that intersects with the world of technology and data. these data network effects may be a useful concept in pedagogy, not only in platform teaching, so when you strategy teaching, but also in teaching of product management and product development. We also think that data network effects can play a very important role there as well. And also teaching of digital transformation more broadly, right? So I'm seeing that myself right now in my work with Microsoft and looking at the data-driven transformation journey at Microsoft. I mean, I see data network effects at play as Microsoft is now competing on these cloud-based, data-driven kind of 365 cloud-based products and services. Right. They are also kind of competing on data network effects, so I think that the teaching across these different areas could benefit from our article. And then when you think about policy, so I do kind of think that these discussions around what should happen with these platform companies, right? Break them up because they are considered to be too monopolistic. The power, what's the source of that power that these platform companies have, right? And so considering more strongly the role that the data collection and the learning from that data, and also the way in which that happens through the use of AI, considering those logics of how these platforms actually work, I think that's very important to consider that, because you see that with policymakers that they oftentimes make assumptions of these companies working as if they were traditional companies, right, through human-centric processes. And then they ask these questions to these CEOs of these platform companies and ask things from them that they cannot implement because their business model was not designed for implementing those kind of human-centric manual processes. And so basically, it's very important for these policymakers to understand how these business models actually work in order to make more targeted policies.
Perfect. Well, I just first of all want to congratulate you on having your paper accepted to AMR and look forward to seeing it in print. It is a terrific paper, which I recommend to everyone in the audience, especially if you're interested in artificial intelligence. This is actually out of the 11 research papers that I've interviewed authors from in the series so far. 3 are on the topic of artificial intelligence, so I would say that's probably a trend. There seems to be quite a lot of interest in developing new theory with regard to the management and organization of artificial intelligence. So thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And also, again, thanks to my co-authors and thanks to Elena Fua and thanks to the reviewers. It has been a tremendous experience. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.